Right, well, as you can see, I've been around for quite a long time. I studied here in, oh God, I can't remember, is it 74, 75? I came to Leeds to do what was called communication design in those days. I chose Leeds because it had a very good film department. Before that, I did a foundation course at Loughborough College of Art. Fantastic course, because basically it took all the pretensions out of us and just made us concentrate on the basics. Drawing, marks on paper, always remember that. Forget about shading and clever stuff like that, get down to the basics, learn how to draw, how to conceive things. It's all marks on paper or whatever the equivalent is, get everything down to a simple level. So a foundation course I found was fantastic. But I had a burning ambition to make films. I'd started doing it at school. I was brought up in the Midlands, I was born in Leicester. So what I want to do is actually just try and demystify the process of what happens at Aardman's. Because when I left Leeds, I was encouraged by a tutor in Leeds, a guy called Adrian York, to go to Bristol. So that's what took me to Bristol, on the recommendation of my Leeds tutor. I did the course, it was called Radio, Film and Television course in Bristol. Basically covered all the disciplines quite intensely. Fell in love with Bristol. It's a great place. I met a lot of like-minded people there. And I was still very interested in animation, particularly stock frame model animation. At Leeds here, I did very little model stuff. I did quite a bit of 2D animation and quite a lot of live action. But it wasn't really until I got into Bristol, and somehow Bristol seemed to have this reputation of actually drawn in lots of people who were into stock frame. When I left the RFT course in the late 70s, with a colleague, I'd done the RFT course, so we set up a collective called the Bolexbrothers, where basically we used stock frame, not because we wanted to be stock frame animators as such, but because it seemed a very accessible way of making films. You didn't need a lot of money, you could make stuff on your, so they were joke, on your kitchen table. And we did a whole succession of films, we did pop promos for local bands. We got some commissions from the BBC. Also at the same time as I left the course, I got to know the couple of guys there who were doing some plasticine animation, Peter Lord and Dave Sproxton. They called themselves Aardman Animations. There were only two of them when I first met them. And at the same time we had this little collective called the Bolexbrothers. We also started working with Pete and Dave, and they were starting to get commercial work. And they've been doing a series for the BBC of lip sync, basically taking vox pops, real people talking, and then animating to it. A tradition which has sort of kept on, as you probably know. We'll perhaps show you a few examples. So that's sort of potted history, but that's sort of where I came from, how I got into it. I say it was a stock frame, something I always enjoyed doing, and I was very influenced by people like Ray Harryhausen. Used to love this stuff as a kid. I was also influenced by a lot of things like Thunderbirds, like the Jerry Anderson films, which were puppet programs, but basically had a lot of miniatures in there, set building. So it's the sort of world I wanted to work and live in. But I've always loved the physicality of it, and that's always been very important to me. I will shut up for a minute, let's just show you a few things. Now, one of the early films I did, so the Bolexbrothers, I was saying we used to love doing things in camera. We called ourselves the Bolexbrothers. Anybody know what a Bolex camera is? You, sir? Nobody else know what a Bolex camera is? When I started out, camera equipment was very expensive, really. But there was a camera, Bolex camera, it's made in Switzerland, which was sort of made for the amateur market. But as a camera that did everything. You could do stock frame on it, you could wind it backwards, you could do variable speed shooting on there, you could make mats and put them in front of it. You could do loads of little tricks in camera. So I adored this camera, and I suppose it wasn't until I came to Leeds I actually got to use one properly. And by the time I got to Bristol, as soon as I got any work in Bristol, I was saving my money and buying lots of old Bolex cameras. Good thing about them is they were quite cheap, you could buy them quite cheaply. And we were doing all our filming on these cameras, and Dave Borthwick was one of my colleagues from the RFT course in Bristol. We got together. And eventually we nicknamed ourselves, we were like brothers making films, and we thought, so we called ourselves the Bolexbrothers, and that's how that sort of collective started out. And we were doing things, one of the commissions we had was the BBC. They'd give you a little bit of money, not much, and the access to a pop song, and you could make a new little video for it. This has a mixture of all sorts of things. We've got pixelation here, we've got these are all Action Man figures, you know, little articulated dolls. But every trick in here is done in camera. There's no post-production on these films at all. I can hear the grass grow. I can hear the grass grow. I see rainbows in the evening. So that was one of a good example, I think, of like what we found the joy of stop frame animations. When you break things down to one frame at a time, you can do all sorts of magic tricks. And I say all of those were done in camera. We didn't have computers in those days, I don't think. I think we had electricity in that. But things like, certainly on long exposures, I always love doing them on long exposures. If you get a light on a black wire and spin it around on a long exposure, you just get all those lovely light trails and things. Yeah. Yes, you can make your eyes disappear by getting the actor to, to move around while you're shooting. Using like 2 second exposure time, I always find is a good constant. You can do lots in 2 seconds. So it's something to try. I mean, the fact you can do lots of things on computers nowadays it's not so joyful, I find, it's actually just to try and do that magic within a camera. I'm going to leap forward a little bit now, just because that's the order I've got it on here. It brings it up to date in terms of what we've been doing at Aardman's. We recently did the film Shaun the Sheep, sort of a year ago now, but it came out. A film I'm quite pleased with because, about all the changes and all the things we've learned, one thing we did is going back to basics, and Shaun, I think, was actually pure and simple stop frame animation, and in fact it's silent comedy. It's all about visual storytelling in stop frame, and I've got here as a little piece here which I filmed as behind the scenes stuff as we were actually making the production, which actually, just to demystify the process somewhat, it's all on a large scale now, but it's all about moving things one frame at a time. But just to show the scale of what it's like at Aardman's these days, this is some of the behind the scenes footage here. So it's great fun, isn't it? Building sets you can walk around. Same as tabletop animation, we got one figure on the tabletop, except now we've got hundreds of cars and other characters running around. So anyway, so to give you some idea of what it's like behind the scenes, that's the world I work in. so for Aardman's, this is how it started, plasticine character Dwarf. Beautifully designed, because he's got no armature inside him, he's solid plasticine. Designed so he's actually self-supporting. He's got quite sort of thick legs on that. I think you say the ideal plasticine character, really, isn't he? Yeah. This is like a typical. This in the early days. This is for typical tabletop setup. Although this is actually reconstructed for a book here, but yeah. Basically, Bolex camera. That's the Bolex camera. That's what you all owe our lives to. Basic setup there, two lights there softened with tracery in front of them there, and one backlight there just to give a bit of shape. And that for years was the sort of basic morph lighting setup. Kept fairly simple, but yeah, always nice to have some modelling when you're lighting stuff there. And as I say, in this case there, although most of it's soft light, that backlight does actually gives a bit of interest to the character. And then so early on, this idea of the Vox Pops. I sort of think, Ards first started getting sort of popularity, and this is a scene from Creature Comforts, which is Nick Potts, one of Nick Potts' early films, the one that won the first Oscar. Again, they were just little tableaus, basically, just taking a piece of real dialogue and then animating to it.
My room is a bit too small, really, and I've got so much stuff in it that if I get anything new, there's just nowhere to put it.
Just a sort of wider view of the setup there, quite simple lighting. A soft top light there, really. There's quite a common way of lighting sets in the way for the bottom of Wallace and Gromit. Have a fairly soft light from above, and I think there's a backlight on there, and there's a little soft light at the front there. But quite simple lighting style. Well, here's some actual footage. This is going back to the wrong trousers.
Yeah.
Just
Got your hand in that room.
Yes, sorry.
So here's a very young Nick Park at work here, is it? But basically just seeing how simple the setup is, yeah. And of course, back then as well, Nick was actually literally animating frame by frame. So all the mouth shapes are all sculpted in the figure. So it was constantly just resculpting the character. And the characters were mostly solid plasticine there. I think Wallace had a solid chest area, but we had plasticine arms, hands, face. Quite a time-consuming way of doing it, but that's how we did it then. And now, one of the other things I like about the stop frame stuff as well is always having to improvise. It's something slightly out of the box, but it's quite obvious things quite often. But also what's important, if you've got a shot like this, where he's actually walking up the side of the building, we were trying to do that in a room with a ceiling up here. So the obvious thing we had to do there was actually we didn't film it like that at all, we just filmed it like that. We put the camera on its side and put the whole building on its side, so as he's walking up there, it's like the old Batman trick, isn't it, climbing up the building. But this is a trick we constantly come back to. It's a nice work in this physical world, but accessibility to things, like if somebody's going up a steep hill, which we had in Loaf and Dave, well, the hill was like quite a steep one, like 45-degree angle. If we'd built it as a hill, you'd have one of it down here and the other end would be up there. So the animator would be constantly have to go up and come down again. So we didn't. We built the whole thing on that level. So all the buildings were actually built at an angle. So the whole thing was horizontal, so the camera could move horizontally. But it was actually on a tilt. The camera was tilting. And also, there's a trick we've done time and time again, is when you have something like that, you also get at one end of it, you light it exactly the same that end as at that end, so that when you've actually done your shot, you can track down to there. And when you get to this end, you just push the camera back up there and just realign it, and then just carry on. So you actually have an infinity track. Very important for us, because we're always doing chase scenes. And that's quite an important trick there. You've got an infinity set, really, and if it's on a slope or whatever, you just make it all horizontal. In the train chase, we thought, well, we could perhaps use motion control. We knew a bit about motion control. It was in its infancy then. We had some sort of computers to control camera movements and some trackers. We did try a little sequence, computer controlling camera, smooth movement. It basically looked rubbish. Because it had no energy to it, really. It was just like, okay, you're moving along with an object. That's all very good. Car chases and that are all over the place, and shaky can do all sorts of things. So we built a camera dolly. We had some old tracks from a proper camera dolly. Built a sort of a camera mount that went on these wheels in front of it. And basically the camera, we can't really see it here, the camera's actually mounted on here. On the rest of the dolly, there's little rods coming off. And they're either pushing or pulling the character. And again, wrong trousers had no digital manipulation in it. We didn't have it in those days. Everything you see in wrong trousers is in camera. So if you see the train shooting along there, it's either being pushed just out of frame, or it's being pulled just out of frame. So if you have look at the train chase, it's worth trying to analyse what we did, because basically it's actually really simple, but you never see anything flying in the air. Everything's sort of being moved from out of frame. It's like or hidden rigs, and that was basically how the whole of that sequence was done. And it was done manually as well. So the animator would actually animate the characters on his train or whatever. He'd go back then, he'd stand behind the camera. We'd marked out on the tracks 3-inch divisions. So he'd have a trigger there. It was set for 2-second exposure. Remember the old 2-second exposure, always important. He'd press the button, and in that 2 seconds, he's got to move the camera from there to there. And the rod's either going to push the character along or pull him. So at the end of the day, hopefully, the character hasn't vibrated too much. He'll be sharp and focused. The background will be blurred, which means you can get away with a rubbish background as well. So on the set here, that is just photocopied wallpaper and a carpet there. The furniture we can move around. So basically, for the whole of the sequence, animate, right, push it along a bit, animate a bit more, and push it along until we get to the other end. It's lit the same at that end as this end, bring the camera back and carry on. Which is why these shots go on forever and ever. They can do it in infinity set. Yeah, and as you say, that's in that instance there. I think he's probably been pulled along just out of frame, so you can't see the rods there. It's a bit here as Steve. We've got very little footage of this behind the scenes of this because the period it was shot, we didn't really have cameras on the go all the while. So that's how to do a chase scene. Nowadays, we can't quite work like that because we use a lot of rig removal. We have to be able to repeat all the moves exactly. So nowadays all our camera moves are computer controlled, and absolutely repeatable. So when we have a scene that somebody's moving along, generally we'll have a rig in there that's holding them, and it's in full sight of the camera. We will then take the characters out, shoot the whole scene again, just the background with the camera move. So we've actually got something to paint, so we can actually paint out the rigs. Another thing as well, there's something we've talked about as well, is the size of cameras. And these 35mm cameras are enormous. A whole family of puppets could live inside one. To get everything down, one thing about stock frames, generally, is you want to work as if it's in real life. Everything is from the puppet's point of view. So you want the camera actually down at their eye level, which when you've got a camera that size is not always easy. So quite often on something like the train chase here, we have a little thing called a pentaprism here, which is basically like a mirror. It's a glass prism, but it acts like a mirror at an angle there. So the camera's actually pointing down there, but it's actually looking out there in effect. So that's how we used to get the camera down to the puppet's eye level. Very important there, when we started Chicken Run, again, it was very expensive to digitise film because it's all shot on film. So when we started Chicken Run, we actually envisioned we'd have like 300 shots where we could afford to digitise the film to do rig removal and stuff. During the making of Chicken Run, because it takes us such a long time to make a film, the technology had changed enough that about halfway through it, we thought we can afford to digitise the whole thing now. By about 2007, I suppose we started, we did a batch of Loaf and Death, and this was our first venture in actually shooting digitally. And basically what we're using there is off-the-shelf digital SLRs, Canon 1D Mark III. But already it's nice that you can actually get it into the set quite easily. You don't need such big trackers and that if you've got any camera movements and that. So quite a revolution. The thing that worried me about going over digital, it was, especially on the Wallace and Gromit film, was would it have the same look? And we did try out several cameras, Nikon cameras, Canon cameras. The Canons did have a sympathetic look to the palette. And all these things are quite important, I think, on Wallace and Gromit. Over the time, you developed a sort of a colour palette that looks right. I mean, the colour palette for Wallace and Gromit, I mean, all the sets are actually painted with a lot of white added to all the colours to keep a sort of chalkiness that matched the plasticine. And you're always working together, but as the teams get bigger, you always have to keep working together. I mean, as DOPs and lighting people, we have to work very closely with the set dressers and the designers. Because the colour palette that they give you is what you're going to work with, and the sort of how things are lit is depending on the colours actually in there and the contrast levels. It is very much a teamwork thing. And particularly set dressers, when we're lighting the sets, generally it's about the same time the set dressers come in. And their set dressers are great, they're like the opposite to cleaners. You come in with a nice beautiful set to put up there. we start lighting some basic lighting, set dressers come in there and they mess it all up. No, I've been quoted on saying this to one newspaper, and they said, we've got these beautiful sets and the set dressers just come in and mess it all up, which is what they do. What I meant to say is they beautifully distress it to make it look lived in and to make it actually look real. And that sort of goes hand in hand with the lighting, I find, to a certain extent. Yeah. And with all these films, what's always important, they are real. And they have their own reality as well. They're not just real in the sense that they're a copy of our world. They actually are a world in their own right, and they have their own look. And that's something you do it subconsciously, I think, but fingerprints and that, we discovered way back. I mean, when we did Chicken Run, we spent ages smoothing the characters down so they had no bore and no fingerprints in there. Just looking at it afterwards, this is because our first time we did a feature film, thought on the big screen, that's going to be really distracting. And just thought, it's actually lost a little bit of the charm. When you look back at the old Creature Comfort stuff there, the fingerprints all over the place. It's, when the character moves his arm up there, you can see all this stuff going on there. Sort of part of it. I think if you actually liked the handmade look, there's something about it. If it's a good performance, if the animator's done a good job and you believe in the character, the fact that you can see how it's made in that is actually a plus rather than a negative, really. First thing I'd say is, any aspect that you like of what you do, just do it. I mean, that's the best thing. If ever an opportunity comes up, if you can say, well, I've actually worked on this, I've done this, I've made my own film, I've made my own models. But also particularly storyboarding, storytelling. One thing that we're always desperate for, or Aardmans are desperate for, is actually people who are going to come up with the ideas for the films themselves, and people who can actually tell the stories, and people who can actually, Because at the end of the day, people like me can't actually carry on working unless people come up with the ideas. And this has actually been a problem with Aardman's for a long time. Is that we've been working full about these wonderful projects. At the end of it, we think, right, we've done that. What's the next one? Nothing has happened because the thing that's lacking is the people coming up with the ideas. So this is how we generally start off. So this is stuff from Shaun. So it's been written as a script. Yeah. Fortunately, on this there's no dialogue, so in fact it's all visual stuff. So a little sequence here. We'll then take it to a live action stage, and this is what we do very often. This is always hilarious. So the director will take the animators into a room, this was secluded space, and actually act it out. This gives you an idea of the timing. It's a way for the director to actually put over to the animator of what he envisaged, he or she envisaged. And this is how the storyboard to the live action, and this is what came out of it. For some reason I've got several versions of that before going into them. And this is the final thing from the film.
What?
So everything else, how do you actually transfer those ideas? How does that sort of work there? But this we found to be the best way, really. Obviously, a written script is something to go through, and quite often if we're working out, we'll get that early on in the process. And always at the end of the day, though, remember that between that and the final result, there's always things that can actually improve, get better. They should never get any worse. You think, this is working now, we can take it to the next stage. Let's act it all out. Now, we've learnt a bit more about the timing of it. We've found out what the director wants, what he's expecting. And on the towers that the animators have, they'll actually have that live action version. That's their sort of guide. So the director doesn't have to keep coming in and saying, look, I want it this way or that way. They know from that live action version, this is what the directors actually wanted, the sort of timing of it, the pacing. Back on Chicken Run, a lot of the backgrounds there were painted. On Chicken Run, you see a background there, and in fact we even built a giant cove that went over the set, because there's a lot of looking up shots in Chicken Run because it's from the chicken's point of view. And for the nighttime shots, they were the background was painted, and I used to project clouds onto the backdrop. But again, I always find the best thing to do is to go in open-minded to any setup and just look at it, look at the scene, and think, yeah, well, what have we got here to play with? If you go in there with a fixed idea of what it's going to look like, you're never going to really advance that much. But I'll just show some bits of this. In terms of testing, when we started the Shaun movie, I had a couple of weeks just to play around with some of these aren't the actual puppets, these are sort of old puppets or some cardboard cutouts. And just to explain to the ways of, with very little money, because they had a very little budget for this film, is to how to make crowd scenes really without great expense. So the models in the background, there's cardboard buses, there's a bus from one of the TV series, there's lots of spare characters, but one of the things they did was actually using cutouts. I thought, well, use shallow depth of field, so the people in the background are blurred, so very impressionistic, and the people in the foreground are very blurred. So in which case they have to make full-scale puppets. We just made one puppet and took photographs of it as a walk cycle. I think it's a 12-frame cycle of a walk, just as cutouts. So a lot of these are actual cutouts. But this is early tests. And this is stuff I was just shooting on old bits of remnants of other sets. And again, choosing camera viewpoints that so they're either hid a lot of detail or. I think it's very, very crude, but this is to prove a point, really. And unfortunately, it's something we didn't really take up that much in the film. It never, scenes that were going to be like this were cut. But. And just a little bit about costumes and that. Normally the puppets are very limited costume changes because it's expensive and time consuming, but it's got a range of costumes there and one nude scene. So that's it for them, and that's all I've got on yeah, that's what I got visually there.
Okay, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you ever so much for coming to